Hi, and welcome back to Biology 206. Today we're moving up again in scale from the ecosystem. So we've just been looking at communities and ecosystems. Now we're moving up to landscape ecology and ecosystem management. Okay, so when we think about landscapes, it's a collection of ecosystems, collection of communities over a larger scale. So we're moving up once again in scale. My name is Dr. Jennifer Beltzer, and we'll get going now. Okay, so landscape ecology, it's a subdiscipline of ecology, all right? And so any of the, we've looked at community ecology, we've looked at population ecology, we've looked at ecosystem ecology. These are all subdisciplines of ecology, and landscape ecology is another subdiscipline. This subdiscipline emphasizes the causes and consequences of spatial variation and surface features and the biota associated with those surfaces with those features across a surface, okay, across scales. So you can imagine this situation where you've got, these different surface features, specifically water bodies, and different soil types. And so we have a whole lot of different soil types that correspond with these colors, and they're configured in a particular way across the landscape. We know that those soil types are associated with particular abiotic conditions that promote certain plant communities and not others. And we can look at, the vegetation associations. Of course, in this landscape, we have a lot of disturbance. And so, for example, over here where there's all this agricultural activity, it's really strongly associated with this moist calcareous loam soil that's depicted by the beigey color. Okay, so you can start to pick up these associations between surface features and landscape features, whether they're natural or man-made, in this in this discipline where we take it to this much larger scale. So one of the main foci of this discipline is to look at to think about the configuration of landscape elements in relation to one another and what this means for the ecology of the system. Okay? Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. There are certainly some excellent courses at Laurier that tackle some of these types of methods. But I just want to highlight the fact that this discipline has really advanced in leaps and bounds thanks to technological advances we've had over the last few decades. Specifically the ability to, the computing power to be able to work with the data layers necessary to work at large scales. So when we think about that, many people have heard of GIS, or Geographic Information Systems, computer-based systems that allow the storage, analysis, and display of data pertaining to geographic areas, okay? So a lot of times when we're working with spatial data sets, these are very large data sets that may have a lot of different layers, and it takes a lot of computing power to work with those data. These computer advances, the processing power of computers now has allowed us to actually do this kind of work much more effectively than it was possible before. In addition to computing advances, we've had advances in technologies for being able to look down at the surface of the Earth, specifically satellites, which give us continuous coverage across very large areas and oftentimes repeated passes at different frequencies that give us, a temporal resolution of data collection that we haven't had in the past. So large spatial scales and repeated measurements by these satellites as they orbit the Earth. Aerial photos, likewise, we've been using aerial photos for a long time, but for example, the explosion of drone technology that allows for repeated flights over different, really high resolution data collection over particular parts of the landscape. So these kinds of technological advances have really moved us forward. And then when we think about, GIS, when we think about spatial ecology, we're thinking about coupling data from ground-based studies where we look at, for example, the distribution of a particular species in relation to environmental variables. We've talked about this repeatedly through the course, linking a species distribution to biotic and abiotic conditions on the landscape. So we were able to develop, statistical associations between a species and particular environmental features that we're able to map with, for example, vegetation cover. All right, and these kinds of data are gathered through these types of methods that give us a continuous, a continuous coverage of these features at a landscape level. This kind of map would not be possible with someone out in the field just, making measurements. This requires this type of technology to create this continuous coverage. We couple that, now we know something about, let's say, the vegetation cover. We know something about the vegetation cover and its distribution at the landscape scale. We have information about how a species of interest is related to those vegetation cover characteristics, and then we can start to scale that up and say, okay, well, then what is our anticipated distribution of this particular species? And as we saw in Dr. Strahlberg's talk, then we can apply different models and say, well, as this vegetation shifts, what will that do to the distribution of the species of interest? We can also think about this in the context of protected areas. Let's say our lark bunting was a species of concern, and we wanted to know how well the distribution, the current or future distribution of that species was reflected in the protected areas network. And so we can start to overlay other pieces of information once we have these distributional models. Okay, so species distribution models, we heard about that from Dr. Strahlberg. All right, so I just wanted to, highlight how important these technological advances have been in allowing spatial ecology to really leap forward and be able to develop much more robust and effective tools for supporting landscape management planning, for supporting protected areas planning, conservation planning, all of these different important disciplines. Okay, so just a little bit more terminology. Landscape, just a few definitions. An area in which at least one element is spatially heterogeneous, so it varies from one place to another. And so again, if we look back to this soil map that we saw, we see that there is spatial heterogeneity. So there's variation from one place to another in the soil type we have at the surface of the surface. Okay, so we would consider this to be a landscape. We're interested in this case in these surface features and this surface geology, and these different soil types are heterogeneous. They have a configuration that, the soil type varies from one place to another, so we consider this to be a landscape. And then another important term is mosaic, and this is probably a term that's familiar to many of you. So this is the composite or pattern of heterogeneous elements that make up a landscape. Okay? So in this case, if we, the mosaic is the configuration of these different soil types in relation to one another. All right? Another important term that we often hear about in the context of succession, so in our last lecture, I believe, we were talking about succession, primary and secondary succession. And a shifting mosaic is an important thing to keep in mind as we're thinking about those secondary successional processes, right? So this is the creation of new patches via disturbance is balanced by the maturation of old ones via succession, such that the landscape maintains a constant proportion in each patch type. Okay, so I'm just going to, is this the one I want? No, I'm just going to flip forward to this map, for example, and I'll go back to the other slides. But in this case, we have all of these different stand age classes, and stands that are 1 to 25 years old in the gray are going to mature to be 26 to 158 years old. So those gray areas will shift into the yellow areas will shift into the green areas, etc. So you can imagine those colors, the distribution of those colors on the map relating to stand age shifting as the stands mature. And then these 324-year-old ones, or some proportion of these older stands, will shift back into the gray category, right? So disturbance will punctuate the landscape, will remove some of the older stands and turn them into the younger stand age classes. And the younger stand age classes will move forward into these older stand age classes. And so then when we talk about shifting mosaic, here we have a lovely mosaic of stand age, and it's that component that relates the concept of mosaic to those important ideas of disturbance and succession that we talked about in the context of communities. Okay, so shifting mosaic. So we've covered off on these two terms. That's great. A couple of additional terms. Scale, and this is really important. It's spatial ecology. We're talking about scales, right? So this is the spatial or temporal dimension of an object or process. All right? And so we can talk about time scales, short or long time scales. We can talk about spatial scales, small spatial scales, large spatial scales. And then within those, there's some additional nuance. So grain is the size of the smallest homogeneous unit of study. So the resolution, oftentimes in spatial ecology, the grain is a pixel size, right? Because we're using different images to create maps of the landscape. Okay, so if we think about grain size, we have 3 different maps here, all of the same area, okay? And so the area is a 5-kilometer by 5-kilometer region in Yellowstone National Park. And each of these colors corresponds to a different forest type. So yellow is non-forest, red is lodgepole pine, early succession, so recently burned. Green is lodgepole pine in its mid-successional stage. Dark green is lodgepole pine in late successional stage, etc. You can look through those categories, but each of these colors corresponds to a forest type and a forest stage, okay? In this case, our pixel size is 50 by 50 meters. So within this 5 by 5 kilometer region, we have 10,000 50 by 50 meter pixels, all right? And so you can see a lot more detail in panel number 1 than either panel number 2 or panel number 3. You can see that this fairly fine resolution map gets coarser and coarser as we reduce the grain size. So here we go from a pixel size of 50 by 50 meters to a pixel size of 100 by 100 meters. So now there's 2,500 100 by 100 meter pixels. Okay, and then over here we have 200 by 200 meter pixels, and there's 625 of those. So in this case, you can actually see the pixels. Over here, it's harder to see the pixels. Here, you can actually see those little squares. Each of those is 200 by 200 meters, okay? And so when we talk about grain, this is what we're talking about. And a related term is the extent. And so this is the area or time period encompassed by a study. And so again, if we look at this same area, we can look at, so here, this is a subset, you can see it up here, a subset of this larger 5 by 5 kilometer area. So in this case, each of these maps, so number 6 is identical to number 1, they're all at the grain size of 50 by 50 meters, but the area encompassed by each of these panels increases as we move from 4 to 5 to 6, okay? So we see an increasingly large number of pixels. So 4 has the smallest number of pixels, 5 has the medium number of pixels, and 6 has the largest number of pixels. They all have the same grain size, but the spatial extent that we're talking about varies from one map to the next because the area that we've mapped differs between those. Okay, so we've got grain and we've got extent. And these two things are pretty related. When you're thinking about a landscape ecology study, where you have small spatial extents, so if you think about that picture number 4 in the last image, where you have small spatial extents, you typically use a finer grain size. Where you have very large spatial extents, your grain size tends to be much coarser. And the reason for that is if you imagine a situation where you're on the one hand mapping a stand, and on the other hand mapping all of the forests in a province or a territory, for example, you would not use the same unit of measurement for this stand level study as you would for this province or territory level study, okay? And so an example from my own research is we have a mapped forest plot in one location in the southern part of the Northwest Territories, and the questions we're asking there have to do with the implications of permafrost off for forest composition and structure and function, okay? And this plot is 10 hectares. And we have it broken down into 20 by 20 meter grid cells, okay? So fairly fine resolution. We map every single stem. So in fact, it's an even finer resolution than that. But if you think about the pixel or the grid cell size we're using, it's 20 meters by 20 meters. Then as you move up in scale and you want to think about forests across the entirety of the Northwest Territories and think about how different processes, wildfire, permafrost thaw, are impacting those, and try to develop maps of what is currently there and what may be there in the future, you tend to use a much larger pixel size. So on the one hand, we're using, we're mapping every single stem, and where those stems are within these fairly small grid cells. On the other hand, we're selecting pixels at the territory scale. We're selecting pixels that are 250 meters by 250 meters, and we're looking at stand types within those much larger pixel sizes. Okay, so we tend to have where you have small spatial extent, use a fine grain. Where you have a large spatial extent, you use a coarse grain. Okay, landscape heterogeneity. These are our last couple of definitions. They're just important things for you to understand. So landscape composition and landscape structure are two things that we think about in the context of landscape heterogeneity. Okay, so landscape composition is the kinds of elements or patches in a landscape and the proportion of each type of element. So you can think of this could be, we just talked about species richness and evenness, and you could think about this component as an analog to that, right? The kinds of elements or patches in a landscape is kind of like the species richness. How many different elements do you have in this landscape? In this particular landscape, we have 5 different elements, 5 different colors, just like in the example of the butterflies, where we had 4 different colored butterflies in that example, if you recall, pink, yellow, blue, and orange, I think. Now, the second component of this is the proportion of each type of element. And so that's kind of like the evenness. And so if we look at this landscape, what we see is that, very young stands, the 1 to 25 year class, they're not well represented in this landscape. They're fairly rare, right? We talked about rare species. We can also have rare landscape elements. Whereas the older stand ages, so 248 to 323, which is represented by dark blue, and 324 to 560, which is represented by red, they're pretty common in the landscape. So these are more abundant or dominant land covers in this particular landscape. So you can think about the landscape composition as being very similar to those species level terms we talked about already, okay? An important part of this is that it's defined by the user. For this particular study, the researchers were really interested in, these broad stand age classes. That might not be appropriate for every study. And so the way you break up the landscape, the way you define the elements in the landscape are going to be a function of the types of research questions you're asking and what you know about that system already. So as an example, some work that we did recently in the Northwest Territories looking at the recovery of caribou lichens following fire, we set our stand ages. So we similarly use stand ages. We use different categories than they've used. We set our stand ages to try to really carefully bracket an age category that was thought to be quite important to the recovery of caribou lichens. So it's, in caribou management guidelines, says that after 40 years a stand will be ready to be used by caribou again. It's mature, All right, and so we were really interested in making sure we carefully bracketed that 40-year age class to see, okay, is there actually some inflection point where lichen abundance, lichen biomass starts to decrease, its increase starts to decrease at this point, for example? So we had that particular question in mind when we defined our elements in the landscape. We also use different stand types, right? So the because you expect that lichen will recover at different rates in different stand types, and so the elements in the landscape will be defined by the user based on the research question. Okay, so landscape structure is the physical configuration of the different elements that compose the landscape. So again, how are these oriented in relation to one another? Do you have aggregation of certain elements in one part of the landscape versus another part of the landscape? All right, these are the kinds of things that go into the landscape structure. Okay, so next we're going to move on to habitat loss and fragmentation, and this is an important theme of this course. We've talked about how habitat loss and fragmentation impact different systems and different processes, and this is one of the key drivers of species loss globally is particularly the loss of habitat. So we've got our two biggies, which are climate change and habitat loss and fragmentation, and probably to date, most certainly to date, this is the major driver. We've lost a huge proportion of the areal extent of many different habitats worldwide. Okay, so habitat loss and fragmentation. I'm just going to start with this little example from Lago Guri in Venezuela. And I really encourage you to watch this video. It's narrated by John Cusack, so he's kind of fun to watch in this very different context from the movies he's typically in. And this video, starting at minute 247, goes through this example. You're welcome to watch the whole thing because it's a fascinating video, but this is a video put on by PBS and National Geographic, and it's called Strange Earth, and in this particular episode, they go to Lake Guri and look at the impacts of fragmentation in this system. And it's really, first of all, it's amazing to see the changes that have happened in that place in response to the flooding that was implemented for a dam. And it's great to hear the scientist, Dr. John Terborg, actually talk about the work. This is really pioneering work on landscape fragmentation and habitat loss. And I really encourage you to watch this video if you have a few minutes. Or watch the whole video if you have a bit of extra time. Okay, but I will give you the little rundown. Basically, this dam was put in place to provide electricity, hydropower to the population of Venezuela, and it's you can see it's a massive, massive dam. But the reason I put this picture in place was to show this landscape. Okay, so if you imagine, and in this video it actually does a really nice job of removing the water and showing you what that landscape might have looked like before the dam was put in place. But if you imagine this landscape before this dam was here, all of these little bits that are popping out of the water as islands, those would have been hilltops. Okay, and so you can imagine all of this area covered by water was actually the lowland forest in that area. So this is a dry tropical forest, and all of these islands were the tops of hills at one point in time before this dam was put in place and flooded this entire area. Okay, so Dr. Terborg used this massive landscape scale disturbance as an experiment. It was not an experiment that any ecologist could have possibly gotten permission to carry out, but because the government of Venezuela was putting in this dam, Dr. Terborg took advantage of the fact that these landscape fragments, these now fragmented pieces of tropical dry forest, had once been continuous. What happens when we fragment a landscape like that? And so they have been monitoring these islands, and you can see these islands up in this picture from your textbook as well. They have been monitoring these islands now for a very long time, since the dam was put into place, and watching changes in the animal populations and the plant populations in response to the fragmentation of this landscape. And your text shows one example of what is happening, and it's a pretty dramatic effect here. So on the y-axis we have percentage of saplings. So saplings are just small trees, and we have the island size here. So not only did the whole landscape get fragmented, but islands are of different sizes. You can see a small island there and a large island there and maybe a medium-sized island there. So we have different sizes of islands, and so they were able to not only look at fragmentation, but also at fragment size and how fragment size might mediate the response. And so what we see here for both, this is for small saplings, so maybe guys that are this tall, and this is for large saplings, so taller, larger saplings. And you can see the percent of the saplings that did these different things. So red is die, mortality, orange is growth, and blue is recruitment. So what we see for both categories is that both large and small saplings, the vast majority of them died. And this was mediated to some extent by island size. So larger islands for both small and large saplings. We saw lower mortality rates, higher recruitment, so the blue bars, higher recruitment on the large islands, particularly for large saplings, higher recruitment also for the small saplings, and greater growth, at least for the small saplings on large islands. All right, so we see some impact of island size on these demographic processes, so mortality, recruitment, growth. But by and large, the impact of fragmentation is really negative. And what's actually happening on this island is that it has to do with these trophic cascades that we've already talked about. So as the landscape was fragmented, it was flooded and broken into these little fragments of dry tropical forest. The large predators that would have been on these islands, so pumas and jaguars and large carnivorous birds, could no longer be supported by these fragments. And so they either died or they emigrated to other larger intact portions of the landscape. So there are images, for example, in that video of jaguars swimming away from these islands after they've been flooded, okay? So we lost pretty much all of the large predators in these islands, and what happened was an explosion of the herbivores, so howler monkeys, iguanas, leafcutter ants. So depending on the island, the process is different, but in all cases, the loss of these large carnivores led to what is referred to by Dr. Cherbourg as an ecological meltdown. The populations of these herbivores exploded because they lost their predators, and this has resulted in behavioral changes. It's resulted in just the kind of the annihilation of the vegetation communities. In some cases, these islands are just being completely denuded of all vegetation. In other cases, it has led to really strong selection toward, it's led to species that have strong anti-herbivore defenses being selected for very strongly and being able to be maintained, whereas those more poorly defended species are lost from the island. So big changes both in the animal populations and their behavior, as well as the plant community composition, structure, and productivity, as we see denoted in this sapling data. Okay, so for the full story, check it out. It's a really cool video. I really encourage you to watch it. Okay, so habitat fragmentation, to kind of get into the nuts and bolts of it. Here's a very long definition. Lenore Farrig, who's at Carleton in Ottawa, she's one of the leading researchers in this field and has done some amazing work She's an amazing landscape ecologist. And this is a definition from one of her papers. So habitat fragmentation is defined as the process during which a large expanse of habitat is transformed into a number of smaller patches of smaller total area, isolated from each other by a matrix of habitats unlike the original. Okay, so this is a great, very complete definition of habitat fragmentation. And I just have this asterisk here. This, so habitat fragmentation necessarily involves habitat loss. Okay? When you fragment a landscape, you can only do that if you imagine any of these scenarios where the dashed box originally would have been completely green, and now we have these smaller patches of landscape of intact habitat within it. You see that there has been habitat loss, okay? So we have a combination of a reduction of the total area of the original habitat and it breaking up into smaller bits, okay? And so when we look at this, A and B have the same total amount of habitat compared to C and D. C and D have less total habitat. But B is more fragmented compared to A. D is more fragmented compared to C. So when we think about fragmentation, it's often confounded with habitat loss. And so this is a point that Dr. Farag has really tried to instill in people, is that, we often talk about the really strong negative impacts of habitat fragmentation. That's often attributable to habitat loss. Not always, but often. And so habitat fragmentation is actually, if you maintain, this is true fragmentation, if you maintain this, you have two areas with similar total area of habitat, but one is broken up into smaller pieces compared to the other. This is a more fragmented landscape than this one, despite the fact they have the same total area. Same thing for D compared to C. Okay, but in reality, in the real world, when we have habitat fragmentation, it always involves habitat loss. Okay. So, one thing to recall is this relationship that I talked about in terms of species richness being a function of total available area, okay? And this is important to think about when we're thinking about habitat loss and fragmentation. When you lose habitat, when you break the habitat into small pieces, this is going to reduce the number of species that it's able to support, okay? And so what we see when we lose habitat, so here's a great example of forest loss in the United States. Here's the forest coverage in 1620. Like the entire eastern half of the United States was forested. Much of the western half was forested. These areas are too dry to support forest ecosystems. By 1926, you can see how little of the original old growth or mature temperate deciduous forest is remaining in the eastern portion of the United States, and the western portion has been fragmented as well and reduced in area. And then, by 1990, there's none of this original old growth forest remaining in the eastern U.S. except for this little patch here, and much less is remaining in the western United States. Okay, so this is a great example. This is a highly fragmented landscape compared to this one, but you can also see that a tremendous amount of the total area has been lost. And so if we think about the number of species, mature forest species that this can support, it's going to be a lot less than what this could. And likewise, when we get down to this little tiny remnant patch, much, much less than either of these situations, okay? So as intact habitat area is reduced, loss of species occurs. And we can go back to that Lago Guri example as a great demonstration of this. Immediately, there's this immediate loss of species when you reduce habitat area because certain species need much larger areas to exist, the large predators in the case of Lago Guri. So we have that first impact of habitat loss and fragmentation, which is just the reduction of area. But there's some additional implications of fragmentation, particularly when you're talking about, forested ecosystems, for example. And this is what we refer to as edge effects. Okay, so if you think about a large intact area of habitat, the majority of it is interior. A very small amount of it is exposed to whatever the adjacent matrix habitat is, or non-intact habitat is. So edge effects are the diverse biotic and abiotic changes associated with habitat boundaries. And so if you think of this forest, you've got this intact forest here. Here's the forest edge. There's where clearing has been happening. You can imagine all the changes like that have occurred at this forest edge compared to when there were trees here. You think about walking through a forest, it's nice and cool and moist, and it's very shaded. Now you remove trees from this area, and all of a sudden the dynamics here at this edge are going to change. Okay, and different edge effects penetrate to different distances, and this is what this is showing us. So this is the distance the edge effect penetrates into the forest. And this is taken from work by Bill Lawrence and colleagues, and Bill Lawrence has really spent his career trying to document the impacts of fragmentation and these edge effects that we see here. And this is just from a meta-analysis where he documented this in a review paper. And so here are just a few examples. This is not exhaustive. If you go to this original paper that's cited on the side, the list of changes that happen from edge to interior are extraordinarily large. But you can imagine increased wind disturbance. If you're right at the edge of a forest, the impact of the wind on the trees there is going to be much greater. And so we often see greater instances of blowdowns at forest margins, for example. Increased tree mortality. This can be for a number of reasons. Sometimes wind disturbance. Sometimes the trees are not well, are not suited to that newly highlight, drier, high disturbance environment. May also be the case that proximity to edge leads to some disease, right? So there can be penetration of various species, pathogenic, herbivorous, competitor species, etc., that wouldn't have happened if it was an intact forest, but are able to penetrate into the forest because of the edge. Invasion of disturbance adapted beetles. And you can see that these different things, these bars indicate how far it penetrates into the forest. So wind disturbance penetrates almost 0.5 kilometer into the forest, right? Decreased soil moisture penetrates about 75 meters into the forest. Increased air temperature, about 60 meters into the forest. Invasion of disturbance adapted plants. So we see this repeatedly, this invasion. So we have these various, and this is just a subset, but these various aspects of the forest conditions that are altered when an edge is created. Okay? So I'm not, just to go back to some of the ideas that we talked about in the context of Dr. Farrig's definition of habitat fragmentation, and the fact that, I think I want to highlight here that, fragmentation and edges are not always bad. We have natural edges throughout the natural world, and these habitat edges do create diversity of conditions, and this can have both negative, we see some of these negative impacts, and also positive impacts on systems. And so it's just important to keep a balanced view of this. Edge effects, fragmentation and associated edge effects can also lead to population isolation. Those, edge effects can create a barrier across which species are not able to move, and fragmentation, of course, separates populations. And this leads to, you can imagine a once contiguous forest, like we saw in the Lego Guri example, that's been fragmented into a number of smaller patches. There's going to be a range of edge effects, and depending on what that matrix is between them, in the Lego Guri example, that's a really extreme example because it's water between the islands. But we can also think of terrestrial environments where there's equally extreme and unhospitable matrix habitat. So think about, paved areas or really intensive agricultural lands. This fragmentation and the associated edge effects can really isolate those populations and lead to strong increases in inbreeding effects. So the population is smaller, so we have a smaller population that's not as able to get out of the patch, move to another patch. This can lead to, not only loss of species, but increases, reduced population sizes and associated genetic and evolutionary impacts, including inbreeding depression and genetic drift. And so these are coupled consequences of this physical fragmentation and the associated, mortality events that happen in these smaller fragments. Okay, so this idea of, isolation of populations flows into the next slide, which is the idea of biotic flow between habitat patches, okay? And so if we think about fragments in a landscape, we've got the patches denoted in the brown and matrix. I've already mentioned matrix, but now I'm going to give a definition. This is the non-habitat, okay? So the habitat is the habitat, and the matrix is either, we certainly have, as we've already talked about, we have natural landscapes that are heterogeneous. And so not all of that landscape will be habitat for a particular species. So there are matrix conditions that are pretty amenable to species moving. You think about that mosaic of stand ages that we saw a few slides back. Most forest species would not, their movement from one patch of old forest to another patch of old forest would not be inhibited by a patch of intermediate age forest. If instead you had an agricultural field or a paved area or a road between those two patches, it's a very different story. And so it's really important to recognize that the quality of the matrix can vary greatly. Everything from completely inhospitable, paved over, intensive agriculture, whatever you want to think about in terms of an inhospitable environment, to something akin to what I just talked about, that the matrix is just a younger age class or some structurally comparable habitat that doesn't have the resources that a particular species needs, okay? So matrix varies greatly, and that will dictate how organisms move from one habitat patch to another, okay? And this is a really important thing to think about in the context of biotic flow between habitat patches and how it can happen, whether it happens, etc. Okay, so for there to be biotic flow between habitat patches, we need connectivity. So this can be a hospitable matrix, as we just talked about, or it can be a corridor. And a corridor is an area of hospitable habitat that connects two fragments and facilitates biotic flow. So we see an example here where we're able to have, we have four patches, and we have, in the one case, both matrix 1 and matrix 2 are inhospitable to movement, but we have this corridor depicted by the blue that connects these two patches. And so we have movement of individuals between these two patches, but the other patches are isolated, and these two patches are isolated from these two patches, okay? In contrast, here we have a situation where the matrix is more hospitable, and you can see that movement of organisms amongst patches is greatly facilitated by the fact that we have this matrix that is hospitable to the organisms in the patches, okay? So matrix condition, corridors, both really important for thinking about how organisms will move from one area to another. And here is an example taken from the Edmonton Area Land Trust, where there's some other ideas, these smaller patches that may not be perfect habitat, but they provide stepping stones between one large intact area and the next. Corridors, having a diversity of ways that organisms can disperse from one area to another, from one fragment to another, is important. And so this all leads into the idea of designing protected areas, and this is a huge, we're just going to scratch the surface of this. The field of biogeography the ecological field of biogeography has spent a huge amount of effort, and biogeography and conservation biology, massive amounts of effort trying to figure out the best ways to configure landscapes to support the conservation and protection of the organisms that live there. And so a set of rules based on some of the ideas we've already talked about have been promoted. So first of all, there's aspects of reserve size. And so here we have different configurations, and one is better and one is worse. And so the general rule is that, you know, a large area, a large reserve size is better than a small reserve size. This is intuitively sensible. We know that species richness is a function of habitat area, right? So the larger the area, the more species you're going to be able to support. You're going to have greater habitat heterogeneity. You're going to be able to support larger population sizes. Both of those things are going to, you know, make those populations more resilient and create opportunity for more species to be present there. So reserve size, this is unequivocal, you know, bigger is better than smaller. Now, when it comes to the number of reserves, this is something that's a little bit more controversial. And so, you know, there's a whole debate in the literature: single large or several small, the SLOSS debate. So here we have a single large reserve, and your text indicates that this is better than a few small ones of the same total area. I'm just going to flip forward. This is from that paper by Lenore Ferrig that goes into some ideas. You know, we have a number of mechanisms that can lead to negative effects of fragmentation. So a single large that's the same total area as several small, you have fragmentation only, not habitat loss, right? So in this context, we have those negative edge effects that we already talked about. Because the patches are smaller, there's going to be increased per patch extinction rate. Smaller area means smaller population sizes, means greater chance of extinction. And reduced movement success, because you have these patches that organisms have to move between if they're going to interact, okay, or recolonize another area. All right, so these are all negative things, and they're definitely really key components when you're thinking about landscape configuration, you know, the best design for protected areas. But there are a number of mechanisms that could lead to positive effects of having a number of small fragments, a number of small protected areas of the same size compared to a single large one. So there can be some positive edge effects. We talked about the fact that this increases habitat diversity, right? Reduced inter and intra-specific competition, because not all species will be in the same place, because you'll lose some species in some fragments and they'll be present in others. Population sizes will be less. There may be reduced competitive interactions. For some species, there will be increased movement success compared to having a single large protected area. Importantly, risk of spreading. So when we think about pathogens or parasites that may infect a population, if you have a number of small patches, these negative impacts of pathogens, parasites, or some, you know, unexpected disturbance like a hurricane or a tornado, the risk will be spread out. So it's a kind of a risk spreading exercise to have multiple small protected areas, okay? If you have them all together, any of those things will have a negative impact and could wipe out entire populations. If you have them spread apart, you may have some redundancy, and you'll have spread your risk across the landscape. Stabilization of predator-prey or host-parasite interactions, because organisms can, you know, move away to there are other patches for them to move to, and so there's the potential to mitigate some of the, you know, avoid having a predator or a parasite wipe out an entire population, because those organisms can move to other places, and it can stabilize those interactions. Increase landscape complementation and higher habitat diversity. So by having patches in more areas, you may cover off on a wider range of conditions than having a single large area. Okay, so This is not to say that I have strong views on whether single small or several large is the right answer, but just to highlight the fact that this was a paper published in 2018, so there's still discussion about this idea of the values. There's obvious values in having large intact areas of unfragmented intact habitat. But there's also value in these smaller protected areas, and we need to keep that in mind as we're thinking about landscape planning. Okay, so back to our rules. So your textbook says that one large is better than several small, but just flagging the fact that this is, not necessarily the one answer. Reserve proximity. Several reserves close together are better than several reserves far apart. And both of these relate to the connectivity and the ability of biota to disperse between fragments. Okay, so reserve connectivity, connected reserves connected by corridors are better than unconnected reserves. So both of these relate to that flow of biota between patches. And so by having patches closer together, the risk of moving between one patch and the next is reduced. By having patches connected, that even further reduces the risk. Okay. Now, obviously, there's potential when you have patches closer together, or when you have patches that are totally connected. There's certainly the increased potential of disease transmission, et cetera. Some of those things that we talked about in the context of the previous slide. Reserve shape. Compact shapes are best for minimizing boundary length. So what we want to do with reserves is reduce that edge area, right? The larger and more compact your reserve, it minimizes the edge to interior ratio. So you'll have more interior compared to edge. So those edge effects will be less of a lower proportion of the reserve. If you imagine edge effects that penetrate, a quarter of the radius across this circle, when you think about this elongated shape, those edge effects are going to be most of that reserve. Okay, so when you have a long, narrow reserve, the reserve will mostly be comprised of edges as opposed to interior habitat. And we know that edge habitat can create important habitat for many species, but if the whole thing is edge habitat, then you've lost the habitat available for those species that are really interior forest species, okay? And finally is this idea of buffer zones, that it's better to have a buffer zone than not. And this is really important. This is actually, this is a guiding principle of the UNESCO Man of the Biosphere reserves, that you have protected areas that are surrounded by buffer areas that maybe are multiple use areas but are intact, reasonably intact, but are used more than the protected area. And what this does is it provides that it reduces edge effects in the protected area. It provides additional habitat for or provides an area that's a protected, that is safer for organisms to move around in compared to the surrounding matrix. It provides a really important protective layer around that protected area. If you have these buffer areas also, and you've got people interacting with this, let's say it's a forest, people are going to use this buffer area. It means that they're going to, in many cases, not need to come into the intact protected area and make use of that, right? So lots of reasons that buffer zones are really important. So there's a number of rules when we think about protected area planning, when we think about configuration. There's a number of rules that we think about and is kind of configurations and conditions that are better and worse for the maintenance of species of interest. Okay, so despite the fact that there's conversations about whether single large or several small is better or worse, there's general consensus that retaining large, intact, compact core areas with buffers is an ideal situation, right? So leaving as much habitat intact as possible with as much buffer around it is going to be the ideal situation. And we see this depicted here in Madagascar. So here's the remaining forest in Madagascar, and they have this large core protected area that's surrounded by these buffer areas. All of the white stuff is already deforested. The park boundaries are delineated by black, and they've left these buffer areas where we have sustainable harvesting of timber is permitted in the buffer zone. But the buffer zone still provides some habitat value, right? The core area is the part of the protected area that is, protected from all human activities. Okay, so there's no question that having these large, compact, completely protected areas is really critical to the conservation of nature. Okay, just to flip back here, we talked about this aspect of reserve connectivity and corridors. And this is just to show you what some of these corridors can look like. So here we have an example where maybe we have two fragments of forest and this, agricultural area surrounding it. And this narrow strip of forest has been left in place and provides kind of a safe haven for organisms to move between one fragment patch and the other. Okay, so this is an example of what a corridor could look like. And here's a map of Bhutan, and that's exactly what these light green strips would be like. They're almost like buffer areas, but they're corridors that maybe are used, but are provide this kind of safe passage between one protected area and the next. And so you can see all these fragments of protected areas, and Bhutan has done this amazing job of ensuring the connectivity of their protected areas in the midst of otherwise completely deforested and areas of high density human settlements. Okay. Other examples that you might have seen, these are underpasses. So when we think about, highways provide a really special and horrible case of habitat fragmentation, where not only do you have to, traverse an inhospitable habitat, but there's the high potential that you're going to be hit by a vehicle and killed. Okay, so conservation biologists have done a lot of work in promoting these wildlife corridors, both underpasses and overpasses that provide safe passage across these really dangerous this really dangerous matrix. And indeed, there's evidence showing that animals are so disinclined to cross highways that you can actually have genetic separation of population when you have roads separating one patch of habitat and another. Okay, so these kinds of corridors are really important for promoting safe passage of animals. You can see deer passing through this particular underpass. Anyone from New Brunswick will have seen these all over the place along the highways in New Brunswick, and typically this is what you see. You see fencing that stops the animals from crossing where we don't want them to cross. Fencing that guides them and funnels them up to these passageways, okay, and provides them safe crossing. Now, of course, there's some potential negative impacts of that. If you're a smart predator, guess where a good place is to hang out? On one side or the other of this wildlife corridor, right? Or hanging out at the edge of one of these underpasses, for example. But your chances of, you have better chances for wildlife crossing one of these and potentially dealing with a predator than having to cross amongst all the traffic that we have on roads. Okay, so corridors, really important for ensuring the movement of biota from one patch to another. And here's just an example from your text that shows the benefits of corridor for biotic movement. We have these butterflies that make use of these this open landscape compared to the forested landscape. And what the researchers did was connect these fields where the butterfly is used with corridors. Or here's a regular patch without a corridor, And here's their sort of controls. So we often use controls in science where you want to control for the effect of that, maybe that additional disturbance. So in that case, they made these winged ones. So there's corridors that the corridors don't go anywhere though, but they emulate the total distance of this corridor in these two wings. Okay, so we have these winged patches, we have connected patches, and we have totally isolated patches, rectangular patches with no wings. And what they found was that these butterflies moved more when patches were connected than when they were winged or rectangular. And this led to greater pollination of the plant species that they were interested, that the butterflies use. Okay, it's a greater fruit production. So where you had connections, where you had connectivity, butterflies were more likely to move from one patch to another, leading to increases in the services that those butterflies provide to that particular ecosystem. And this was compared to both winged and rectangular. Okay, so this just is one example of the positive impact for providing those connections between habitat patches for movement of animals. Okay, the last thing I want to touch on, and this is something that Dr. Strahlberg already covered, and I think she used a diagram that was almost identical to this. Certainly it's from the same Overpeck paper that she was exemplifying. And I just wanted to flag this idea of the cumulative effects of climate warming and habitat fragmentation and loss. This shows the responses of plant communities through time since the last glaciation. So here's the glacial maximum about 18,000 years ago, and the glacier receding, so the glacier is white. So this glacial recession and the plant communities that followed. And so as the glacier receded, as those areas became uncovered and became exposed and the climate changed, plant communities reassembled in these areas. And we ended up with a lot of, if you recall Dr. Strahlberg's lecture, no analog or novel plant communities. But what we but as the glaciers receded, these species were able to move from more southerly locations and colonize these more northerly locations. All right. And I guess that, a key concern that a lot of people have for species that are trying to cope with the current climate change. So this was a period of really rapid change in the climate, going from this ice-covered period to this relatively ice-free period. Species were able to expand their ranges and refill those areas and respond to the changing climate. So, for example, this particular, the deciduous forest that was down here in what would be, Florida down here, it was able to expand and move up, expand through this area, and then occupy all of what is, the central United States and the eastern United States right now. Okay. In the context of habitat fragmentation and loss, where we have, either really highly reduced population sizes or populations that are completely fragmented and not connected, the potential for this kind of migration from one area to another becomes much more difficult, because you have these matrix habitats between existing patches of intact habitat that may prohibit the dispersal and the movement and the genetic mixing and all of these things that are important for responding to large climate change events. So just want to reflag this. I know that Dr. Strahlberg already talked about it, but it seemed like a really fitting way to tie together these topics of climate warming and habitat loss and fragmentation, because what we have done to the landscape is really going to have a huge impact on how the species, how our modern biotic assemblages are able to respond and move and respond to ongoing climate warming, ongoing climate change, and migrate to other more hospitable areas in response. And so this is a big challenge we face, and there's lots of discussion about different adaptation strategies. So assisted migration is one where we actually help to move organisms from one place to another. So it becomes increasingly intensive from a management perspective, and something we really need to be thinking about, and thinking about how do we better connect parts of the landscape to facilitate movement of organisms. And this is where landscape ecology and spatial ecology come into play. And so it's a really exciting discipline with really important real world applications. And with that, I will wrap up, and have a great day. Take care, everyone.